I knew I was old, but I didn't really need 5 chairs. One would have done it. Good morning, friends. I'd like to begin by saying something I feel very strongly, and that is that returning to Hong Kong brings a feeling of enormous exhilaration to me. And it comes in part from the excitement of seeing this dynamic city emerge from a long period of pandemic-induced semi-hibernation to its vibrant self. I know we've got a little ways to go, but it's really exciting. But even more important than that, at least for me, and I suspect many others, is the real joy that comes from seeing and being near dear friends. Again, people who I admire, people who I have missed greatly in the last 2 years, and people who are an important part of what really matters in life. You know, at my age, there is a tendency for the frequency of these moments of reflection to come along when you sort of pause and quietly by yourself have a moment of thanks for having made it this far, even though the clock's still ticking. But it reminds me, and then I'll get on with my remarks. I went to I'm not going to tell you how old I was, but I went to my 60th high school reunion a month ago. That's just an embarrassingly large number. And it was a very nice event, but one of our classmates, who we're all the same age, stood up, and his remarks consisted of telling us what our conditional life expectancy was. This, needless to say, went over like a lead balloon. So we have wonderful panels coming up, including one right after I speak with Fred and Julia and Terry. And I guess, you know, I'm very excited to hear their thoughts and insights. They're people who have had important leadership roles and just a whole lot to say. I guess my job at the start is to try to find a way to make some sense of this incredibly complex environment in which we find ourselves. It's a daunting task. I'll do my best. So the way I'm going to organize this is I'm going to talk about 4 really gigantic transformations that are underway in the global economy. And then I'm going to turn to some trends, secular trends, that are really powerful and make, you know, the world that we're living in somewhat difficult. And I'm going to try to convince you that there's at least a possibility we're in an inflection point, and there's regime change coming that changes mindsets and how we go about doing our business. And then at the end, I'll try to say something about what, if anything, we can do about this. If you do believe me, we face fairly significant headwinds. So it won't surprise you, I think, to hear that there are just enormously big transformations underway. One of them has already been mentioned. It's the movement of the center of gravity of the global economy to the emerging economies. You know, when Larry and I first started talking to each other, you know, maybe 15 or 20 years ago about development, most of the world was in low-income countries. Now, most of the people in the world, not all, but most are in middle-income countries, thriving, tens of millions of new middle-income consumers. And that's easy to say, but when you stop and think about the implications, it's pretty much everything. From the location of final demand to the architecture of global supply chains and the location of economic power and influence. So it's an enormously important trend. The 3 others are rooted in essentially science and technological revolutions. And again, I'm not going to dwell on them, but I think you know most of them anyway. One is the multidimensional digital transformation of economies with deep, deep implications for productivity, inclusiveness, growth patterns, the structure of the global economy, the nature of work, the growth of the services side of the global economy, global supply chains, and even the sources of comparative advantage. It literally changes, you know, or is in the process of changing almost everything, or at least a very long list of things that are important. The second one is less talked about. There is a revolution in biomedical and life sciences underway. It's enormously powerful. It may be sort of thought of as slightly sort of separate from the kinds of things that we're talking about today, but it really isn't. has just very powerful implications for medicine, health, drugs, vaccines, targeted immunotherapy with respect to illnesses, but even going beyond that for botanical sciences, agriculture, and therefore, sustainability, food security, and so on. It's another area in which there's a transformation underway. And the last one won't surprise you at all, which is there's a massive energy transformation underway with a big technological underpinning. And since we're going to have a panel on that, then I won't say more about that except to acknowledge that it's there. All of these transformations are being driven, when you look closely at it, at the emergence of just tremendously powerful tools and technologies. And what I find so interesting when you go and look at what these tools are, advancement in semiconductors, DNA sequencing, solar panels, gene editing, it goes on and on. What you find is a pattern of democratization of access to these things. Many of them are open source. A huge number of the really powerful algorithms in artificial intelligence, you can just go pick them up. You don't have to pay anything for them. In other cases, the prices are coming down. Let me just give you an example. The first DNA sequence cost $10 million. As some people say, $100 million. We're within months of it costing $250. What that means is that there's all this talent scattered around the world, is able, with rather modest budgets, to get on with being part of the scientific and technological revolution. So it really is very striking. And I think it's optimistic. The one thing I will say about these transformations is that while the potential to do good is enormous, they all come with, lots of bumps along the road and difficult transitions. The digital one is going to make transitions in work and other things a little complicated. And all big, powerful scientific and technology transformations also come with some downside risks that need to be managed. I just want to acknowledge that. Having said that, I'm now going to give you about 5 things I think are going on in the global economy that, when you add them all up, make the world that we're entering right about now very different in feel from what we've had before. So the first one sounds roughly like this. I'm going to try to make a case that this is regime change, an inflection point. The first one goes like this. For the past roughly 4 decades, maybe more, in fact, you could argue most of the post-war period, we lived in a world that had deflationary characteristics. The relative price of manufacturing goods came down, and we all know the reason why, right? Slowly at first, but then, with a huge acceleration, the developing countries entered the global economy. And we basically started to use huge amounts of previously unused productive capacity. You can put this in terms of labor, but it comes down to the same thing. And that basically produced a pattern of declining costs and essentially no inflationary pressure, actually the reverse. Now, if this was an economics class, we'd have to discuss how that pressure spilled over into the non-tradable side of the economy. Some smart student would say, well, yeah, that happened in manufacturing, and the tradable side, but I won't take you there. The result of this is, on the positive side, hundreds of millions of people who are much better off than they were before. But the interesting part of this transition is on the supply side. And you'll forgive me for being a little nerdy, but basically, during this 40-year period, there was no surge in demand that couldn't be met except in the extreme short run, where you had to do the investments, by the productive capacity in the global economy, right? If you're an economist, it means the supply curve's flat, and when you get a big shift in demand, the biggest effect is the quantity effect, and the smallest effect is the price effect. The proposition I want to advance to you today is that very powerful force is fading. And the reason is that we have created a much bigger global economy on the demand side, and we are running to near the end of the availability of underutilized productive capacity. Now, there's a much more subtle version of this where you have to sort of get practical and decide how fast it's going to come. But that means basically a whole lot of things have to change. For example, you know, central banks have been free since I can remember to pump liquidity into the system to try to pop up growth, right? Inflation below target for most of the time they were doing this. That's just not going to be true anymore, right? So you get the idea. One simple way to describe this is the global economy has gone from a multi-decade period of being essentially demand-constrained almost overnight to being in a supply-constrained condition because we have entered, you know, we've run through this capacity and we've entered a point where the global supply curve, the long-run global supply curve, is now upward sloping. Then, this particular phenomenon is then kind of turbocharged by some other phenomena, and I'll just tick them off. One, aging is reducing the productive capacity of the global economy. Aging is occurring in economies that account for somewhere between 75 and 80% of global GDP. Now, there's a lot of countries out there, you know, that aren't aging, but they're not yet large parts of the global economy. And that, you know, that simple phenomenon, and the aging process initially produces a reduction in the growth of the workforce and eventually an actual decline, okay? And you can see that happening in Japan. We're a little further from it in the United States. China's about to turn in that direction and so on. And then going along with that, we have shifts in labor market behavior. Now, I'm not going to stand before you and pretend that we completely understand it, but there's a lot of people who are dropping out of the labor force or acting differently or refusing to do certain kinds of jobs. We have you know, very large labor shortages in absolutely critical areas that are the biggest employers in the American economy: the government, healthcare, and education. Well, if you can't fill those jobs, then you've got a very different situation than what we had before. But that's not the end of it. We have had a run-up in debt levels in the global economy. First in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, then they didn't come down. And now in the pandemic, we had a big run-up in the sovereign debt ratios, which has produced a significant decline in fiscal space, turbocharged by rising interest rates, right? And so that's another sort of potential limitation on public sector investment and potential growth. And so now we find ourselves in this rising interest rate environment with a dramatic reduction in fiscal space. In some of the lower income countries, it's more than dramatic, it's sort of catastrophic. And we're going to have fiscal and financial crises in some of those areas that the international financial institutions are going to need to deal with. And finally, if that's not enough, the global economy is now being subjected to much more frequent and severe shocks from multiple sources. These include climate shocks, which have become a macroeconomic headwind, war, pandemic, geopolitical tensions, and the weaponization of economic, financial, and technological policies. And so the response to that has been something Victor mentioned, but I'll use a different word: diversification. Or to put it differently, economic security in multiple dimensions has been become a priority both for businesses and for countries and policymaking. And that process of diversification is well underway, and it's expensive, right? We have lived in a global economy whose architecture was determined almost entirely for most of the post-war period on the basis of efficiency and comparative advantage. That era is over. That is not the way global supply chains are going to be constructed. I am not suggesting that we're throwing out efficiency completely, but the basis of comparative advantage is going, and security is now part of the game. You know, in the Sustainable Development Goals, we talk about inclusive, sustainable growth. I think we should start talking about inclusive, sustainable, and secure growth. You know, when I'm talking to myself, I now talk about ISSG rather than ISG, because I think it's a permanent part of life. When you add all that up, then basically I think the logical conclusion is that you're in a world that, both in terms of the formulation of policy and in terms of potential growth, just looks and feels completely different than where we've been before. For those of you who doubt this last business about diversification being a significant trend, I would like you to invite you to come back to Europe with me and spend the winter in Europe as we undergo this high-speed diversification of our energy sources to reduce dependency on, now that's an extreme example, but it's certainly by no means the only one, okay? So all of this implies to me that the global supply conditions are really very different. And we need changes in mindsets. We need new growth models. We need a new way of thinking about, the formulation of macroeconomic policy. And at the end, we need new ways of thinking about global interdependence. So the question is, and I'll conclude with this, is all this inevitable, or can we, undo some of this damage? If we have a supply curve where we've hit the upward sloping part, or from your point of view here, and another set of shocks that have moved it up and to the left, I think the answer is yes. Not definitively yes, but yes in at least 3 dimensions. So I'll close with this. One, I personally believe, not everybody believes this, that the digital technologies have the capacity to produce an enormous productivity surge, to essentially reverse the downward trend. Now, I can't prove that, but I've studied pretty carefully artificial intelligence, robotics, micro-robots, virtual and augmented reality, and a whole bunch of other technologies. And I think once they're deployed, they have the potential to produce a productivity improvement of significant magnitude, and also to underpin inclusive growth patterns in e-commerce, in fintech, and we have examples of this. They're not hard to prove, and more broadly in healthcare and education. The other thing I'll observe about that is the incentives to engage in investments that lead to productivity improvement are much higher now than they were before. If you had a labor problem before, there was an easy answer, right? Go where there's surplus labor and get it done. Now, if that's not an option, or it's not as attractive an option, and you need to sort of do something about it, the incentives to invest essentially in labor-saving technology via, capital and digitally intensive capital, those incentives are significantly enhanced. The other thing we can do is we can work very hard, both domestically and internationally, to increase the supply of labor, right? There still are pools of labor that are sort of locked away from the global economy in some of the lower income countries because the infrastructure doesn't exist, or they're not very well organized. And the advanced countries, the high middle income countries, and the international financial institutions can do something about that. And domestically, there's lots of barriers to expanding the labor force. For example, in lots of places, women are underrepresented in the labor force because the support systems for families are not well developed to allow them to move into the labor force. So I think there's those 2 weapons. But the last one, I guess we'll talk about more. So let me put it to you this way. None of this will really work unless we have viable versions of international independence. And, I think most of us in this room, especially the older crowd, probably feel some kind of commitment to the succeeding generations, to our children and grandchildren, to deliver a global economy, or to pass on a global economy that has at least expanded opportunity and security, and certainly not one that's encumbered with ridiculously high levels of risk. But if we're going to do that, then we, and by we, I mean leaders and citizens, have got to, we have got to stop sleepwalking toward a new, unattractive, non-cooperative equilibrium in the global economy, which is where we're going now. And that non-cooperative equilibrium is characterized by nationalism, national security objectives dominating the agenda, by distrust, as was mentioned before, and by a kind of sort of zero-sum version of great power competition. And the only good news, I think, and it's relatively recent, is that the voices from all over the world are getting louder and clearer on this point, and they're saying, we don't want to go down that road, right? And I think now, even from the leaders of the great powers, you're starting to hear an acknowledgement of that. So I guess, let me just end with that. I think that's pretty near the top of the priority list. I've been eagerly looking forward to hearing the panel discussion, so let me just finish by saying thank you for listening to me this morning.
Thank you, Professor Spence. Please be seated, join the panel discussion, please. And now I will call the remaining panelists, Professor A.Y. Tang, the moderator of this session, Ms. Julia Lung, and Mr. Terry Lundgren, please on the stage. Yeah, we'll sit here. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to join Victor to welcome all of you to come to Luk Yo Hall at Hong Kong University for the Asia Global Dialogue. This is the 10th time we are organizing this, and I would say never has been this important to have this kind of dialogue to engage distinguished panelists, everyone in town, and some of our attendees are actually flying all over the world to listen to us, to talk about global challenges. As Mike has already discussed, we are really living in a very uncertain time, and we are actually quite confused also about the future. At least I'm very confused. My job as a moderator is very easy, given that we have such a great distinguished panel here. Time is short. We are already over time by 5 minutes, and I do want to engage you in a Q&A session very soon. So let me just go ahead and ask questions rather than introducing each of you, because Kidedia has already mentioned. We have a great panel here with representatives from Hong Kong, from China, Hong Kong, United States, and the rest of the world is going to be discussed by Mike. My first introduction is, I would like to go with Julia first, lady first. Julia Liang, the Deputy CEO of SFC in Hong Kong, has been an expert on financial regulation, and she has worked at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority for over 15 years, and she was the Undersecretary of Financial Services at the Hong Kong government for 5 years. And I would like to start with her to talk about the global financial market. What's going on with rising interest rate, especially in advanced economies, with rapidly depreciating currency around the world and capital outflows from emerging markets. Julia, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Really glad to join this distinguished panel. I must start by prefacing the views that I have are my own and not reflect that of institution. To come to speak after Mike is a little bit intimidating. Mike talked about transformative forces. Mine is a little bit more myopic. It's something like 1 to 3 years span. But to say that the global financial markets are facing strong headwinds is an understatement. In the past 3 years, we've seen a pandemic, which we're coming out of. We've seen a war going on in Ukraine with raised national security concern everywhere. We've seen disrupted supply chain, heightened energy crisis and food security issues, and of course, elevated level of inflation and elevated level of financial stability concerns. So the financial market, the global financial market has been dealing with multiple shocks, all coming at us at the same time. There are a lot of noises in the day-to-day movements of financial markets, and I would look into three factors that would be deciding. The change in interest rate regime, which Mike already talked about, it's going from zero or near zero for the past decades, and sharply, as if it's overnight, has gone up to high single digit. And the worry is the trajectory is actually uncertain because how do we get there to tame inflation back to the 2% is uncertain. So it will inflict a lot of pains to households and to businesses, particularly those who have been accumulating a high level of debt and leverage in the past few years. Next year will be decisive, whether they survive, whether we survive, or the global survive. There are lots of modeling that, but next year will be decisive, and hopefully we'll get there. Second forces is geopolitical tension, which Victor has already talked about. Friend shoring, ally shoring has slowed down globalization, although I noticed that Mike used the word and Victor used the word diversification and secured. It's just necessary from the manufacturer's point of view as well as from the financial institution. It's also slowed down China's financial integration, its capital markets with the rest of the global capital markets after 4 decades of opening, and particularly speeded up by the mutual market assets through Stock Connect and Bond Connect. Mike talked about inflection points. There was an inflection points when the sanctions tools used by the U.S. Against Russia is sweeping, and it's leading to financial decoupling of Russia. Or Russian banks have been denied access to SWIFT, and also foreign banks are exiting Russia. I'm not passing any judgment. It's just that necessary. These will have implications for us in Asia Pacific. Those who operate in this part of the world will have to take that tail risk into account. And when you think about it, US, China, the two biggest economies, are locked in intense competition, leading to partial decoupling in some areas, and those areas that are perceived to have national security concerns. So it's chips, semiconductor, but the list seems to be growing. So would the two powers be able to manage their competition to avoid confrontation? That was the message that is being sent from Bali, from the leaders. Hanging in balance is quite a lot of things. The most symbolic one is whether the 250 firms from mainland China will be delisted on the US, from the US stock market. I mean, of course, there are audit rules that needs to be observed. So unlike Russia, China is more integrated economically and financially with the rest of the world. And they are more interdependent. And Hong Kong, as an intermediary between China and the West, will have a lot to gain or lose in the process. The third thing I would like to touch on is the climate risk. Climate risk is a slow motion but chronic risk that cannot be ignored from the capital market, from the capital flows and the goods flows point of view. Now, the focus of financial regulators like ourselves is, and we are doing it, mobilizing capital to fund the transition to a low-carbon economy, something that I'm very supportive of. I'm very active on IOSCO. But the word of caution is governments and standard setters need to pay more attention to the fragmentation of standards. That is the reporting standards, the standards that they require their corporates, that might result in further disruptions in good flows and capital flows. EU has just announced that all large companies based in Europe will need to disclose data on the impact of their activities on people and the planet and any sustainability risk they are opposed to. Of course, the objective is a good one because they're more aware and actually making changes. But the new requirements also apply to non-EU companies with turnover of 150 million euros in the EU. So it would apply to the rest of the world. Now, the reporting rules are going to be quite challenging for many companies in the emerging markets, where the GHG emissions data, biodiversity data, and other are either inadequate, unreliable, or unavailable. So the upside of it is it would help bring up the standards to the rest of the world, but the downside is, of course, those who are not able to do it, the capital and the goods will go, the goods market would go past them. Now, so the approach, I mean, I think, which is echoing our speakers this morning, is to work on a globally coordinated approach, more alignment in these sustainability requirements, and also provide sufficient time to transition to what we aim to it. So I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Julia. So we know financial market needs to be better integrated. When everyone is talking about green finance, sustainable finance, we probably need to set some standards. Maybe this is an area where Hong Kong can play a more progressive role. I will come back to you later because I would like to hear Terry to talk about the United States. Terry, the former CEO and chairman for Macy for over 14 years. He's an expert leading figure in the retail industry in the U.S. And we know, at least from our side, we read news and we all know the news are sometimes biased. But the U.S. Seems to have some economic challenges, inflation, potential economic recession. And in the last 2 years, the retail industry is doing great, right? Because the government probably has, passed out a lot of cash to stimulate demand. But tell us a little bit more about the current situation in the U.S. And the future economic outlook. And I'm going to talk about politics later, but let's talk about the economic part first.
Let's separate those if we can for a moment. Thank you, Hayward. So let me start by reminding everyone that America is a consumption-driven economy. Unlike Asia, 70% of GDP is driven by consumption. So when the pandemic struck, it had a very negative impact, of course, as it did around the world. But in our case, it had about a 5% negative impact to GDP. So we put out that small brush fire with a fire hose by putting $5 trillion back into the economy through our government stimulus package. That represents about 22% of GDP. But this takes time to see the results. So we kept adding. We went back on 3 different times to get to this high number, and many would argue that we went back to the well at least one too many times. The good news was that savings accounts ballooned and consumers spent. And one thing about Americans, we're not particularly good at savings, but boy, are we really good at spending, which makes us, the great consumption society in the world for sure. And that also was good for employment. It led to full employment. Unemployment rate was had been very, very low in the 3% range, 3.2%. And one would argue that, of course, we were able to avoid a full-blown recession because of these steps and this stimulus. However, it got to a point where demand simply outstripped supply. We can talk about supply chain as a separate subject. I think America had a lot to do with this because no one could keep up with a 30% surge in spending like we spent. So when we had a big savings account, we spent it. And who knew that we all needed 50 rolls of toilet paper, and 25 rolls of Bounty? I was happy I'm on the board of Procter & Gamble, but this was not. These were spending beyond our means, and obviously it drove our economy, So the positive things came from that. And of course, the Federal Reserve had to step in to slow down this spending. We've seen all of the rate hikes that we have taken. But just like the stimulus took time for us to realize that it was working, that it was helping, so we kept adding more, these rate hikes also take time to take effect. And we haven't seen the full effects of the rate hikes as of yet. So the good news for consumers and for the economy is that our citizens have $1.7 trillion more in savings today than we had in 2019 at the beginning of the pandemic. So the money is there available to spend. Having said that, we have surged in credit card debt, 15% last quarter, which is a record high. And so we are adding debt, to this already high savings rate. So people are continuing to spend at the moment. But these effects of the rate hikes, obviously, the very stubborn inflation numbers, we're at a 40-year high in the United States. And while it's come down slightly in just recent months, it's still extremely high. And when the demand outstripped the supply, it added to these energy high inflation and food high inflation that was already in existence. And I think this is going to create a spending hangover for Americans that will be seen early next year. And when that happens, again, it will of course impact consumption going forward. It will clearly slow down our economy. I'm confident of that. And will we avoid a recession? We used to say we're going to have a soft landing. Not so many people are talking about that. They're saying we hope to have a soft recession, at this point in time, and a mild one that will eventually come out. Hopefully, again, there'll be a lot of interest in having this corrected by the time 2 years from now, right now, which will be the presidential elections in 2024. So that's our expectation. We've actually been better than expected, but the hangover is about to occur in the months ahead.
So let me ask a follow-up question before I turn to Fred to talk about China. When do you expect that the Fed will stop increasing interest rate, given what you said? Seems that the economy is going to slow down a bit next year.
Yeah, this answer is changing daily because...
About today?
Because, you want today's answer? Because members of the Federal Reserve Bank are offering their opinions, but ultimately Chairman Powell will make the final call. But the current expectations, at least that I have, is that there would be at least 2 more rate hikes, and that they would probably begin to fall from 75 basis points, the last one, to 50 basis points and 25 basis points. I still think that is going to be enough because, like I said, these effects haven't shown yet. But if we're a little bit patient, we'll see that this is clearly what we have in place, and what our forecast is will clearly have an effect on slowing down consumption and therefore moderating inflation. Getting to the 2% target, we're a long way from that. I have no expectation that that's going to happen anytime soon, but I think we'll see signs of improvement, and that should be enough to slow the rate hikes.
Great. Thank you, Terry. I have seen some analyst reports saying that the new normal in terms of inflation in the U.S. is going to be like 3 or even 4%. So we'll come back to this kind of divergence in opinions about the future of the U.S. economy. Fred. Basically, just one question, but I still need to elaborate a little bit more. The easy question, well, Fred, by the way, is the founder and CEO of Primavera Capital, and he's also the chair of Yum China, as well as on the board of UBS and ICBC, among many other companies. Expert on the Chinese economy, my simple question is, what's going on in China? My more elaborated version and more sophisticated one is, we know China is still going through the dynamic zero COVID policy. We have heard from multiple sources that the economy is slowing down. We have heard rumors that they may be open up starting the spring next year. Some people say, oh, maybe the end of next year. What's your take?
Thank you, Hewan. If you want to really understand what's going on in the Chinese economy, it's really just zero COVID pandemic control that's been really driving the economy. Right now, I would say the Chinese economy is very weak. It's the weakest I have ever seen since Deng Xiaoping started the reform. And not just the underlying economic activities are weak, investment, consumption, service expenditure, even trade, is been weakening just for, again, a variety of the slowing down of the rest of the world, inflation, supply chain uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty. So all the way down, economic activity and sapped investor confidence, business confidence, consumer confidence. But if I have to isolate all different factors impacting the economy, I would probably attribute at least 2/3, if not 3/4, if not 100%, what's driving the economy is the draconian zero COVID policy. So I sound critical, right? But just I would say I think it's important, to acknowledge China has been remarkably successful when the pandemic happened. Even to now, probably China, weighted by the size of population, has one of the very lowest fatality rates, as a result of the pandemic. So that's a remarkable achievement. So the question is, what has really worked well in the first phase of pandemic is increasingly becoming ineffectual as we enter the second phase, third phase of the pandemic, when the virus mutated from Alpha to Delta, now to Omicron. So the cost benefit for public health crisis management become increasingly nonsensical, because the benefits are elusive, if any, and the costs are real and continue to rise. The number of implications. First of all, Chinese people, I count myself as one of them, are remarkably compliant, patient, and resilient. But with the relentless, sustained campaign of enforcing zero COVID, I really see people's patience is stretching to the limit. There might be more open or passive revolt against the draconian measures enforced by various local authorities. So that would be good. That would really threaten the social political stability our leadership and all of us treasure, number one. Number two, local governments are bearing the primary burden of enforcing the zero COVID. So, after now third year, all the expenditure on, testing, contact tracing, enforcing quarantine and the lockdown is huge, is single biggest expenditure item of local governments. Now, this combined with the slowing economy, particularly the slump in property sector, local government finance are very stretched. I'm just afraid if this policy continues, local governments all belly up, okay, at some point. The third and the last is really, it's just hurting the economy. Some of us may remember, when Wuhan emerged out of the lockdown, in late spring of 2020, the country, really was first to emerge out of the pandemic. Life was normal, economy was booming. But now, since mid-summer last year, this draconian nationwide enforcement of zero COVID, actually zero Omicron, just has taken such a tremendous toll on the economy. Consumers want to spend, but they cannot, right? The beautiful state-of-art airports, high-speed railway stations are left once like bustling, rustling, with the passengers, now all left empty. Manufacturing hubs, Shenzhen, GBA and Shanghai, have been repeatedly locked down. Causes nightmare for even the most sophisticated supply chain management, which I think China is best in class. So this, will continue. This year, I'm very, very bearish on the near term because the economy is the weakest I have ever seen, and if we continue persistent zero COVID, then I just don't see any prospect of recovery, no matter what the PBOC, the central bank is doing, or the fiscal authority is doing. And in fact, there's not much they can do. It's just people are willing to spend. It's just unable to spend. So, on the other hand, actually, I'm quite optimistic about because it's not difficult to engineer recovery. I do think others, as long as China exits from the zero COVID, I do see huge potential of very strong economic rebound. Okay, starting with the consumer spending and services, then also manufacturing. So over the medium term, if you look at the next 3-5 years, I'm still cautious, optimistic. Predict on two conditions. One, zero COVID is a passé, and two, China now after 20 Party Congress, we focus the energy on necessary structural reform and put the priority on economic development.
Great. Well, very happy to hear some optimism about the Chinese economy. But I do want to ask a very quick follow-up question before I turn to Mike. And that is, suppose zero COVID policy is behind us, China has all the conditions to enjoy the rebound due to stimulus, due to increasing consumption, etc. How about the real estate sector and the financial stress that it has created in the financial system? What's your take on that?
So I've been quite cautious towards the public sector for some time. Again, I want to walk back, right? Because as China, last couple of decades, the industrialization, urbanization, of course, that has really, really caused a tremendous and long-lasting boom in property, right? Whether it's commercial property or residential property, because people get richer, they want to become homeowners. And the Chinese, culturally speaking, always put the heaviest weight on real assets. So there's bias towards property investment. So it has had a tremendous, long-lasting boom, and also contributed meaningfully to the economic growth. But there have been a lot of excesses. Some of the developers, just really overextended, highly leveraged, and also property prices, until recently, also arguably maybe too high. Shanghai, for example, is one of the most expensive cities in the world, right? So that also caused some social challenges as well. So that need to be sorted out. And unfortunately, there's no easy way to sort it out, as we have seen everywhere in the US or in Europe or, Ireland, but I, when Financial Times typically put another, or lemon moment of China, by the way, they have said that maybe 10 times, over the last 10 years. I think that's probably overly, pessimistic. So it takes time. There's no overnight quick fix. So, the best comfort I take is the financial system, the banking system, is not going to be really hammered by the property woes. The biggest banks, including obviously ICBC, are still extremely well capitalized with good asset quality, and the exposure to public sector actually is much more limited than you might think. So this is not like the subprime saga, before the global financial crisis. So there are some similarities, but there are also key differences.
Great. So basically, it will be resolved, but it will take time. All right, so let me follow the script because I've been improvising quite a lot in the last half an hour. So I go back to the script that I prepared for myself and talk about new globalization, okay? So, I mean, we have heard enough about, all these negative descriptions about deglobalization, right? Friendshoring, decoupling, and, geopolitics, whatever, right? I don't want to repeat, something that everyone has heard about in the last few years. But I want to talk about the opportunities, right? We know during COVID, some countries were able to digitalize the economy better than the others. We know some smaller economies, especially in Asia, actually benefited from the ongoing geopolitics due to diversification of supply chains, due to restructuring of the global economy. So give us some perhaps more positive description about the world. And I agree with Victor that globalization is not dead. It just took a different form. Right? Now we are talking about digital trade. We are talking about more service trade rather than merchandise goods trade. We are talking about regionalization perhaps rather than multilateral globalization. Have we been too pessimistic about the global economy? Partly because of the news that always drag us back to Ukraine and US-China trade war and all this stuff. Maybe I start with Mike and see whether he has any positive things to say about the global economy.
Sure. Well, I'll just mention two because my colleagues will have a lot more to say. One, if you look at McKinsey just produced yet another version of their global flows, and while trade is not going down absolutely, it's declining as a fraction of global GDP. Services trade, digital trade, and all that is just going off like a rocket, right? So that's the world we're going into, but there's no loss of opportunity in that area. And at a much more microeconomic level, and Fred knows this very well, there is this explosion of entrepreneurial activity, in all of the transformations I mentioned, with lots of opportunity. I mean, it really is striking. I mean, it wasn't that many years ago you could sort of count on the fingers of one hand the places, that were doing most of this stuff. I mean, I used to live in one of them in Silicon Valley, but it just isn't true anymore. China's got 91 unicorns, or that's probably too little by now. Europe, we thought had been written itself out of the script. All over Southeast Asia, India's been transformed by the geo-revolution and the entrepreneurial ecosystem in the digital area that's going along with that. Latin America, and it's starting to happen in Africa. So I think actually there's a lot. I mean, whether you're an investor or you're just excited about, things moving forward in a kind of dynamic way, I mean, I think there's lots of good things going on.
Great. So you talk about three big transformation, right? Digital economic transformation, energy transition, and what is the third one? Oh, health and bio revolution. Yep. In these three areas, which area do you think has the largest room for the big powers to collaborate? This may be a hard question.
I think so digital's complicated. I think, my colleagues will agree with this, but I don't see any reason in the life sciences and in the energy transition that there's really any roadblocks other than misbehavior. I mean, I have to admit, if the United States says, well, we're going to slow you down by denying you access to semiconductors and the equipment that you need to make the most advanced semiconductors, it's a little hard to imagine that when the next week you show up and say we need to cooperate on climate change, that's going to work. I mean, but nevertheless, I mean, on the merits, I don't see any problem with I don't see any adverse national security or other conditions that get in the way of collaboration in that area. Those two.
Great. So mostly in life sciences, as you said.
Life sciences and the energy transition.
And energy transition. Great. Good to hear. Let me turn to Terry about globalization. In the retail sector, do you see companies still buying stuff from China?
We're trying. I think the answer to your question is that eventually rational minds will prevail, and that 8 billion consumers will demand to have the best product or the best service provided by the country that is most capable of providing that. And so that, to me, is going back to some version of globalization, which I believe has ultimately been good for consumers. And I believe consumers who are voters will ultimately win out.
Great. But when you see diversification of supply chains, and we know we have Max Shang here, who is a supply chain expert, diversification comes with a cost, like insurance. Do you see prices rising partly because supply chains become less efficient?
Well, I can tell you, in the apparel industry, we've had deflation for 20 years. And so because we can always find someone willing to make the product better for less money. So I don't see any reason, assuming these artificial tariffs and things of this nature aren't put in place or are eliminated, that why this cannot continue. And I think it will. There is a point Mike made in his earlier comments about we may have stretched the limits of unused capacity and productivity here. But I still think in many parts of the industry that I've served, there's still continued opportunity to keep pricings without huge inflation in the future.
I have to say I miss the huge discounts that Macy offered on Black Friday. So I know Terry is rushing back for the parade tomorrow in New York. So Julia, when we talk about globalization, the focus has always been about trade. But in the financial world, anything that we should pay attention on in terms of the new type of globalization of finance?
Well, Hei-Wei, you want positive news. The good news is globalization is not dead. It's just taken it's not moving in terms of financial globalization. It's not moving at the speed that we have seen in the last decade, but it is moving ahead and also probably take a different form. The different form is like for all the reasons that Mike talked about, the transformation forces, and also that forces you to sort of have deeper relationship with your friends and more secured and diversified in terms of your supply chain. And in the financial world, that means financial exposure. You just have to, we do, financial institutions or investors do a lot of stress testing, do a lot of contingency planning. They just have to plan for these contingency scenarios. And the reason for that, that we can still remain optimistic, is that the benefits of integration, capital markets integration, is too big to be ignored. The rest of the world can share the dividends of China's growth. So this is when when China is back up, as Fred is projecting, it would be too much too much of a temptation not to ignore that. And also, we also know, like decoupling. We've seen, I've talked about partial decoupling. Like all married couple, you have bickerings, and your finances are tied up so much that it would be too painful to have a divorce. So US and China, they are so economically integrated and independent that any divorce would be catastrophic to them. But then, but when they're bickering, I think the expenses would go up.
So basically, we should be optimistic because divorce is more painful than staying together. Fred, back to you about China. We all often heard about all these new terms from Chinese policy documents, right? Like dual circulation, new era, modern socialist economy. Yeah, tell us a little bit about the future of globalization that's sort of in the mind of the Chinese leaders, or maybe what you see from the business sector.
Yeah, I would say communication is becoming a big challenge for the rise of China, because many of the policies, announcements in China are either confusing or maybe just misinterpreted. That's why as soon as the Party's Congress was concluded, the markets, were sold off. And so that's maybe at HQ and the AGI, you can also include in your curriculum, there's economic translation. Dual circulation, so this is in the terms we understand is like more balanced domestic demand and external demand, okay, as opposed to one or the other. Common possibility, that's what Mike said earlier, is inclusive growth, or growth with less inequality or better equality, right? Anyway, so I think, with the 20 party council out of the way, the leadership, obviously is fired upon. They have all the levers of power at their hands. So now it's time for them to do something really great for the country and for the world. First and foremost is really economy, get the economy to recover and achieve sustained growth. Second is continue to encourage entrepreneurship, innovation. China has the potential to become a world leader in technology, maybe biomedical sciences, certainly in energy transition. I would say in this regard, China is already the undisputed global leader. China has been the biggest investor in renewable energy in the world. Actually, China invests more than US, Japan, Germany, France, UK combined, okay, for the last 10 years. Take EV as example. Every 2 electric cars sold worldwide, more than 1.2 is sold in China. So half of the global EV consumption. In terms of supply chain, batteries, not just the batteries, but also the anode and the cathode and the lithium, metal. China alone is 75 to 90% of the global manufacturing and the supply chain. So, China has a big role to play because the technology economy, biggest energy consumer, biggest carbon emitter, but also China can partner with the rest of the world in really, developing cool climate tech, from renewable, from carbon capture, from, electrification of, everything to contribute to, net zero emission. So, yeah, I think the vision of China, I would say, is benign domestically, and China, can also play a positive external role, to help sustain global growth, poverty reduction, and a cleaner, greener, more sustainable future.
Great, a lot of positive notes. I want to open up the panel to Q&A, but before I do that, I'm afraid that this question may not be raised, so let me ask Terry first. The question is about the midterm election. And I was surprised about the results, but maybe I was too naive or I was being influenced too much by the media on this side of the world. What do you think about the outcome, right? Were you surprised? I mean, everyone was saying, oh, Trump is back, and, we may be concerned about, like, the House is, like, too dominated by these polarized Republicans, but it turns out to be quite okay. And, we have new hope that, the democracy in the US seems to be getting people together again and trying to move people to the middle again. What do you think?
I think the person who was most surprised by the midterm elections was President Biden. Because we heard at first this was going to be this red wave, and it ultimately turned into what one of the students referred to as the red ripple. And it wasn't, in fact, a wave. It was actually a huge disappointment for the Republican Party. They had all of the opportunity right in front of them. They have a president of the United States who has only a 30% approval rate. You have an economy that, as I described, was unstable. You have people concerned about a potential recession. You have higher crime rates going on. You obviously have huge inflation on the minds of everyone. So all of this set up for an opportunity for the Republicans to take charge. And it clearly didn't happen, and there's a couple of big issues. And I really think the most important one is that the voters said, enough of this extremism. With all these crazy commentary, this, election denials on one side, defund the police on the other side. They said enough. and they started voting a little more toward the center. That's actually a really good thing, and that's typically what happens in the United States, but it takes a long time to go from left to right, and eventually we come back to center, and we're not there yet by all means, and we're not going to get there probably by the next election. But I think over time, the voters are starting to stand up and say what's important to them. And I think the other important issue was that, people put this abortion subject as a lower priority of big issues in the United States, and no one really was saying that was going to really drive voters. It did, in fact, drive voters. And if you ask women, they're not in favor of abortion or against abortion as much as they are in favor of just having the right to choose. And that right to choose leans towards the Democratic side. I think that mattered to many voters, and then the young voter came out. So 1 in 8 voters was under 30 years old. So the Generation Z is showing their face on the voting ballots, and that's going to continue in 2024. And clearly, they have important issues on their mind, like climate, like right to choose, and the like, that I think also helps sway the vote. So these are the kind of things that I think people did not anticipate that occurred, but will probably get the Republicans to take a different tact in the next 2 years to get control of the presidency, if in fact that is an opportunity for them at that time.
These are all great news. Next year's speech, we may need to remove the term "the rise of populism." It seems that things are sort of swimming back to the middle again.
Let's hope.
Great. I'm fully aware of the time. I want to spend 15 minutes for Q&A. I know distinguished speakers don't come in front of you all the time, but please state your name, talk about where you're from, but make sure that your question is short. Don't give a long speech, okay? There's a question at the back. Please use a microphone.
Varun Berry. This is a question for Fred. Thank you for being so candid about the impact of COVID-0 on China. As an aside, I found it interesting that President Xi was photographed in Bali without a mask on, so hopefully that's a hopeful sign. My question really is about the future and form of innovation in China. I was out of Hong Kong for a while this summer, and I spent time in the States, and there really was this concern that you have some very enterprising and creative companies in China, but regulation, has been so unpredictable, and there's been a severe clampdown. What form is innovation in China going to take? Is it going to be within SOEs? Will some industries be allowed to prosper? So if you can, shed some light on that, because for now, most of the people I spoke to in the US said, not another cent being invested in China. We just don't know what's going to happen there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. You're absolutely right that the draconian crackdown on tech over the last few years have had a chilling effect on entrepreneurial spirits in China. But despite the sweeping nature, from everything from e-commerce, ride-hailing, social media, ed tech, fintech, but there are still a large swath of the innovative activities are left intact. For example, climate tech. If you are doing something next-gen solar panel or next-gen EV battery, those there be no tighter regulation. And biomedical sciences, whether it's medical devices or drug discovery, are still left largely free. Even in digital, the IT hardware, so if you do chip design or manufacturing, obviously that's also been encouraged. So yes, the crackdown undoubtedly has been negative, but there's still, China is a behemoth, so there's still big parts of the economy are still reasonably free winning, and not surprisingly, innovation continues at a very rapid pace. Now, it's bad, for U.S. investors to shy away from China, but maybe temporarily for self reasons, that's good news for me. But I do, feel like U.S. and China together are the two world's most vibrant and the largest tech innovation ecosystems. The pool of human capital. Let's think about it, just graduates in STEM, in science, engineering, every out of China. And fresh them into PhDs, frontier fields, life sciences, and also actually there's no shortage of financial capital, which is venture investing or private equity. Of course, the stock market, right, with the Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. Together this is the one of the it's just the leading capital market in the world. So all the conditions are in place. We just need wiser, enlightened regulators and the political leadership.
Again, Professor Lau. Please give a microphone to Professor Lau in the front.
Thank you, Haywire. I actually have many questions, but I only asked one. I really like Mike's talk, and I want to address this question to him. Diversification, as you and Victor mentioned, and decoupling, I sometimes call it second sourcing. They're really the same thing. But I think we need to look at it in a more positive light, because that's like insurance. Because you are insuring against not just weaponization, right, but also against natural disasters, insuring against epidemics. So I think actually there's room for it, for diversification. It also dilutes the power of monopolies. Okay, so I think we need to think of the positive side of diversification. But my question is really the following. I think in order to prevent weaponization, I think we ought to promote this idea of economic interdependence. I think that is actually a very important concept, because you think about what's happened to Nord Stream, the pipeline. Okay, that was actually an intentional project on the part of Merkel and the Russians, so that, okay, so this is a way in which the Germans can receive relatively inexpensive and reliable natural gas, and the Russians can receive hard currency. Okay, and they become, mutually interdependent. The hope is that neither side would want to upset the arrangement. Okay, and I just wonder what you think of this idea of economic interdependence, basically as a way of preserving part of the benefits of economic globalization. Thank you.
Wow. So on the first point, which wasn't a question, I completely agree. We can describe it in different ways, but you're right. And there's lots of shocks that are not geopolitical or friendshoring or anything in like that category, where it's just rational to buy insurance, and companies and policy is going to move in that direction. But I guess what I would say to you, Larry, on the Merkel-Russian deal is, how's that working out for them? I mean, the theory, at least in the West, was we'll be so interdependent that nobody will upset the apple cart, right? And, and by the way, we'll converge in terms of governance structures. And, so I think what's happening now, and my colleagues may have different views on this, is that, people are scratching their heads and said, what do we get wrong? The United States has a fairly unique position in this, and, so I think we might as well say it. Because of its central position in the financial system, this weaponization of economic and financial instruments is really quite dangerous. and it's, you may think it's a great concern here, only here in Asia or in the developing world. Actually, I hear it all the time in Europe. Now, the Americans and the Europeans might say, but in the context of the Ukraine conflict, we didn't have a choice. We could either sit back and let it happen or actually engage in physical conflict. So this is a hard question to answer, but I think there's no question that on the American side, there's a fairly serious underestimate of what the consequences of this kind of pattern of weaponization. But honestly, Larry, I don't think the evidence yet suggests that interdependence eliminates the destructive behavior. At least, I'm not sure I could make that case. Do you all have a different view of it?
Okay, great. I want to maximize the number of questions. Well, 3 hands. Brian, I saw your hand earlier, and then 2 more questions, and I probably have to close the panel. Brian Wong. Microphone to him in the front, please.
Thank you so much. Hi, thank you very much, Brian. It's a real pleasure to hear and honor to hear from all of you. I just have a quick question concerning ideology, because it strikes me that theories of economic globalization and mutual benefiting are very much rational and sensible and logical. And yet, in practice, we've seen an upsurge in ideology in favor of isolationism, nationalism, disintegration and balkanization of global supply chains, CF friendshoring, strategic realignment, and also, of course, the CHIPS Act to top it all off. Can economists make sense of ideology, or is there a case for geopolitics here that is independent of or just can't be captured by economic theories as they stand? Thank you very much.
Who wants to take this question? I mean, he mentioned economists, but I'm a moderator. I shouldn't jump in.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, this is a tough question. I will answer you privately. But I think economists are taking ideological differences a lot more seriously than before. There are lots of practitioners here from the business sector, and in the past, they probably think a lot about efficiency, just-in-time outsourcing, and how to maximize profit. And now they probably have to take international relations, your expertise, and geopolitics a lot more seriously in the business planning. And it's not easy. So I used to teach at Johns Hopkins Science, a foreign policy school, and I've never imagined a better job market for them. Right? They got jobs in investment banks, in private companies, in the retail industry. Everyone is hiring the so-called chief risk executive, to deal with all these uncertainties that we face in the future. So the short answer is yes. And the academic economists, a lot of them finally woke up and realized, well, in addition to writing our mathematical models, we probably have to incorporate the political situations in our research as well. Mike, you want?
No, that's a great answer.
Okay, great. Nothing better than getting a compliment from a Nobel laureate. I saw 2 more hands earlier. Maybe I can take Shu Yi, a quick one, and then 1 more.
Hello, I'm Shu Yi from AGI. So my question is on zero COVID. So if we imagine a scenario where China decided to just end zero COVID somehow, what do you think they're going to do for households and for the industry? Are they going to send out a lot of stimulus packages, or are they going to go abroad and welcome back all the foreign business? What do you think they should do, in your best guess?
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
Who do you want to answer this question? Anyone?
Yeah, I'm not a public health expert, just an economist. First of all, we all agree that the zero COVID is really the main factor driving the Chinese economic performance, or the poor performance right now. So, getting out of this is the way to go. If China make that decision, I don't expect it overnight, but over the next couple of months, after winter season, after Chinese New Year, maybe perhaps by end of March, basically there'll be no more lockdowns. No matter how the case rates go up, right? No more draconian lockdowns. People can still take, vaccination and also prepare for emergency care. In some of the rare cases. I think be fine, because now we say decision data driven. the rest of the world has been reopened and normalized. We have seen, we can cope with it. So with that, as far as the economy is concerned, I don't expect, any pressing need for a strong policy stimulus, okay? Because there will be almost automatic rebound of the economy. I'll take one example, okay, Yum China. So when Shanghai was locked down, all our restaurants, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut, those are popular places for Chinese consumers, zero business. But when Shanghai reopened, just within a couple of weeks, sales, rebounded to the pre-lockdown peak. It's that resilient, that fast. So I have faith in Chinese consumers, maybe as much as Terry have for American consumers, and also for Chinese investors. If there's clarity, whether it's pandemic control or regulation on tech, on private sector, Chinese entrepreneurs, maybe also among the most dynamic, resilient, innovative entrepreneurs on the planet. So I think just really the government all needs to do just create the conditions, for the private sector economy to rebound. With that, of course, foreign investors in multinationals will also become more encouraged. Yes, these are all the gloom and the doom about China as a whole, economically, politically, geopolitically, the interdependency is real. Think about, Tesla. You may follow his Elon Musk's tweet. You may admire him. You may hate him. You may think he's crazy. You may think he's a genius. But, he decided to build the Shanghai mega factory. Okay? That factory took 10 months from groundbreaking to completion. Only 12 months to commence production. So within a short spell of 3 years, Tesla Shanghai is the world's most efficient, most productive electrical plant by a wide margin, outperform the mega factory in Fremont, California. And by the way, the capex is 65% less than spent to build the same gigafactory in California. So it's easy to talk about decoupling and diversification. People often ignore it takes time and the costs involved. So I'm okay if CEO, like as smart as Terry for strategic or potent purpose to diversify supply chain. That's of course, is fine and maybe it's good. But I'm worried about the diversification driven by politics, by brute force. That's inefficient. That's going to increase tremendous cost, and there's a lose-lose for everyone. Thank you.
Anyone else who want to add to Fred's points?
Well, on Elon Musk, the answer is all of the above.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question, really the last one. I have to support my own group. Asia Global Fellow background.
Thank you very much, Professor Tang. Asia Global Fellow 2022, Bahram Rajavu from Uzbekistan. My question is, I guess, probably to Professor Spence. In these uncertain times, in times of crisis, usually the poor pay more. And what would be your advice to small Asian economies to continue prosper and grow and develop in these times of uncertainty and crisis?
That's a great question. I think part of the answer is what Victor said, which is the regional trade integration, which is proceeding fairly rapidly and in a relatively open fashion. So I'm a little less worried because of those developments about, people being cut out. It looks, at least in Asia, as if you're not going to ignore the little guys while you have some kind of, great power focus or competition or something like that. Having said that, that let me put it in its bluntest form. If you think sustainability and inclusion are the key qualifiers, and let me add security, the key qualifiers to the kind of growth patterns we want to achieve, which regardless where you look, we're not doing very well on inclusion, at least, you know, at the domestic level. We just haven't reversed, most of us haven't reversed those patterns. And we're struggling with sustainability, right? And I think if we fail on the sustainability front, we are failing on the sustainability front. I don't want to preempt this really distinguished panel that's coming right after this, but there is absolutely no question that the failure on that front is an adverse event from a distributional point of view. There's just no question about it at all. I mean, you know, we have desperate migration in Europe that's driven by climate events in Africa, for example. So this is a way of acknowledging that I think, you know, we really do have to sort of get some of this done, not just for survival purposes, but, you know, because the distributional consequences of failures are so dramatically bad. You want to add to that?
One point, related point, but it's different. You know, just talk about the immigration. Terry mentioned a bunch of factors, whether it's abortion or inflation or other culture war, maybe the division driving U.S. domestic politics. But also, I think it's immigration. Right? Certainly, it was one of the reasons for populism. And Trump responded by building the wall, right, to build the Fortress America too. But that I think it would work because the glaring country-to-country income disparity is the primary source, driving immigration, including illegal immigration. So in that context, I do think U.S. and China kind of play a big role. China is a one belt, one road. Is designed to help many of the developing countries to have basic infrastructure, to create jobs, to lift poverty. If I were American policymakers, whether you're Democrats or Republicans, you should wish Chinese good luck. Because it's not easy, in the scale and the ambition of the program. But maybe selectively US can join China and obviously with the multilateral institution, World Bank, IMF, and together, so to make sure developing world, can achieve sustained growth and sustained poverty reduction. Otherwise, definitely North America will continue to be swamped by relentless influx of immigrants from the south, and Europe, will be also engulfed by immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. That's also, driving a lot of democratic politics. So I do think the world will be safer, more sustainable if the big powers, particularly US and China, instead of being consumed of this rivalry, at the expense of each other and the world at large, should really find a way to work together. In a way, I took leadership, post-World War II, right? Related to the global economic, trade, financial architecture. So I think US, has a historical opportunity and leadership role to play, and China should join the force.
I just want to say, Julia, Juliana's my wife. Sorry. Julia, one of the major issues that's being dealt with right now is the unblocking the congestion and intermediation financially to get the kind of massive resources needed in in developing countries to deal with adaptation and mitigation. Do you want to say anything about how we're doing on that front, Julia?
I think we do have a role. I mean, capital flows knows no boundary, should not be politicized, and to the point about the developing countries and what they can do, is to unlock those capital for the high-saving countries in order to get to those needed. And that's intermediation, that's whether it's through Belt and Road, whether it's through the regional trade agreements. This is something that we should do more, not less.
Terry, you have anything to add before we close this wonderful session?
Well, no, I would just say, first of all, it's been a good dialogue, and I think the cooperation between our countries needs to improve. I'm certain it will improve. I was encouraged by the meeting that Xi Jinping and Biden Biden had recently, and then the follow-up plans for further action coming in the future. And I'm hopeful that this is a new direction or a return, if you will, to the direction that was once in place just a couple of administrations ago.
Wonderful. I really don't want to end this panel. I feel that we just started getting into the core of the discussion, but I realize that we are out of time. I prepared a lot of questions and I didn't ask almost any of them. And I have to say, I didn't ask the panelists to stay so positive, but I really felt that I become a lot more optimistic about the future. And I see light about the US-China relations. I really think that if both biggest economies do well, it will be great for everyone. Thank you so much for your insightful sharing, and we look forward to the rest of the day.